favorite watercolor subjects. They come in a variety of very vibrant, bright colors, and they make for a perfect subject to practice watercolor techniques on. My name is Anna. I'm a Canadian Mani designer, and I specialize in botanical and decorative art. In this class, I'm going to show you step by step how to paint 3 different types of viola or pansy flowers. Although each lesson is quite brief, about 20 to 25 minutes, we will practice some key fundamental techniques that are essential in order to come up with a realistic watercolor painting. We'll start off by talking about masking fluid and ways to apply it in order to preserve highlights and prepare your subject before you apply watercolors. Next, we will practice wet on wet and wet on dry techniques in order to build volume step by step and add more realism to your work. And I will also show you on some of the pansies how to combine wet on wet and wet on dry in order to achieve some very interesting results. In terms of the format, this is a real-time recording where you will hear me narrate every step of the way. In addition, you will see a detailed instruction written on the left side of the screen where I will summarize the objectives of each step, materials and pigments I use, and techniques that we will be practicing. In terms of the resources to help you along in this class, you will get the following. I will provide an overview of materials I used, including some alternatives that you may want to consider depending on where in the world you are and which brands you prefer. And for those of you who are interested in learning how to sketch your subjects better, I also included a very brief lesson on how to come up with a perfect pansy outline. So I know from your comments on a lot of my previous classes, this is something that many of you struggle with. If you don't want to use black and white outline that I've included in the class resources, you can take a look at this brief lesson and I will show you a very simple technique that I use to come up with pansy outlines, and you can apply it even without using a reference photo. But of course, I'm going to share a detailed black and white outline of my pansies so you can download and trace them. And I will also include a whole bunch of reference photos, different colored pansies, so you can practice on your own time. For your class project, you may choose to perfect your technique using just one flower at a time, or you can combine them into a more complex composition, kind of like I did here in one of my recent watercolor paintings. If you have any questions as you're moving along with your project, you can post it in the discussion section of this class. If you enjoy the class, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and you can also follow me on social media using the links above. And if you feel like sharing your projects beyond Skillshare platform, do tag me on Instagram. I love seeing your work. Now, if you're ready, let's take it to the table. I can't wait to see you in class. Hi guys, I'm so happy you joined the class. In this first lesson, I'm going to talk about watercolor materials that I use, and you can also download a handout with a summary of tools and also some alternatives that you might want to consider depending on where you are in the world. I know not every country has the same sort of inventory of brands when you go to your local art store or on Amazon. These are the trusted brands that I've tried and used, so hopefully you will find something that you either already have in your watercolor collection or something that you can easily get from your local art store. Paper is the number one most important thing that you will need when painting with watercolor. Brushes and pigments we can have some flexibility on, but paper is the number one supply that will make sure that you get good results if you pick the right kind. So please make sure that you pick 100% cotton paper that's made for watercolor. Anything that's not 100% cotton and not acid-free will not absorb colors in the same way, will not hold water the same way, and will not give you the right results. In terms of weight, you can go with 140 pounds or higher. Higher, of course, is better as it will hold more water. And in terms of the surface, you can go with cold pressed or hot pressed. I prefer cold pressed. It absorbs water in a very specific way, allowing you to work with a wet surface for quite some time before water dries out. So I would recommend cold press over hot pressed. You can see a bit of a close-up here. It's quite grainy and rough, and that's the sort of surface you're looking for. And finally, you can go with loose sheets or pick a block. I like blocks. They're very convenient because you don't need to stretch your paper before painting. If you do go with loose sheets of paper, make sure you stretch it or tape it to your table so that you avoid that buckling effect when you add water. My brand of choice is Arches, but of course you can pick your favorite brand. I quite like cold pressed Winsor Newton paper. Again, it doesn't matter which brand you choose as long as your paper is professional watercolor paper that's 100% cotton. When we're drawing our outline, which you can, by the way, download in class resources, a black and white outline that I created for you, or maybe you prefer to draw by hand. Either way, pick a hard pencil. So don't go with something that's soft because it will leave marks on your paper. Go with something like 2H or 4H, which indicates hardness. I'm using 4H for this drawing. In terms of the eraser, any soft eraser will do, but I just wanted to mention that for precision, I prefer retractable erasers. They're very, very convenient because you really don't want to erase too much on your watercolor paper. It will affect the surface as you paint later on. So retractable thin erasers like this one I have here will really help you just pick up the graffiti marks that you're interested in erasing and nothing else. So this is a really, really convenient tool. In terms of brushes, what we will need is 2 types of round watercolor brushes. And I'm hesitant to recommend pure Kolinsky sable for various reasons, including the price and also how rare they are. I often just use synthetic substitutes for Kolinsky sable, and I find that Escoda as a brand has the best sort of price to quality ratio. So what we will need is one larger round brush for larger washes, especially in the beginning as we're doing background washes, and one round brush that's a little bit smaller and finer for those tiny details towards the end of our work. If you do have a real Kolinsky sable brush, you can probably get away with just one in size 4. Real sable brushes hold a lot of water, so they're suitable for larger washes, and they also have a perfect tip. You can do a lot of detailed work with them. But again, if you don't have a real Kolinsky sable, synthetic sable brushes work just fine, and you only need 2 of them. You can also use real squirrel or synthetic squirrel brushes as well. Again, you'll probably need 2, one larger brush in size 4, 5, 6, and one smaller one in size 0, 1, or 2. We'll need a palette, and my preference is always for porcelain palettes because white plastic palettes absorb pigments and get dirty very quickly, but it really is not that important. You can use whatever palette you have on hand. And for water, we'll need a jar of water. It's actually better to have 2 jars of water because you will use one to clean your brush and then the second one to make sure it's completely clean and clear as you switch from one pigment to another. Now there are a couple of completely optional supplies that I will mention because you will see me using them. First one being this glove, and I get a lot of questions about this. This is simply to help me preserve the paper underneath as I'm painting. A lot of people just use cloth or a sheet of tissue paper just to put underneath your hand to make sure there are no smudges. These gloves are actually made for digital artists. I work a lot on tablets and I find them just as useful for watercolor, completely optional. Next, you may want to consider a watercolor medium like this synthetic ox gall that I use. It's not necessary, but it is quite useful if you're having trouble keeping your paper wet. If your workflow is a little bit slower, it helps you keep your surface wet for longer periods of time. And I also find that if you're working in warmer, drier climate where your paper will be drying a lot faster, you will also find it quite helpful as it will help you keep your surface wet for a longer period of time. The one I'm using is from Core Watercolors, and you only need a couple of drops in your water jar to do the trick. Finally, we will need masking fluid and an applicator for your masking fluid. If you don't have masking fluid for watercolors, don't worry about it. You can always cover those areas with white gouache or white watercolor after your painting is done. But it is quite useful before we start painting to prep your surface in the areas that we want to keep white with some masking fluid. And I really like Winsor & Newton. It's very fluid and almost feels like water. Some other good masking fluid options include Dr. Phil Martin's Liquid Frisket. Make sure to get level 2. Level 1 is quite thick and not as good. Level 2 is absolutely excellent. You can also try Schmincke masking fluid. I really like the one with the blue tint because it's actually visible on paper after you apply it. And in terms of the applicator, I like rubber applicators like this Royal Sovereign rubber shaper. Don't worry if you don't have this specific tool. You can just use an old brush or the back of your wooden brush or a matchstick. Up next, we'll talk about watercolor pigments and the structure of our color palette. Now that we went over our supplies, I'm going to show you the watercolors that we will need for our 3 flowers. I will go over specific pigments and some of the alternatives you may consider depending on your existing collection of colors, and we will talk about the structure of our palette. In other words, a way to organize your pigments for each flower in a logical way with a clear understanding of the impact of light, whether it's sunlight or other type of light, and the impact it has on our pigment choices. You can find a full list of pigments and the palette for each flower in the class handout, which you can download on the Skillshare website. You'll get a handy table just like this. So first things first, I only have 8 pigments that I used for these 3 different flowers. 2 of them, blue and orange, are completely optional. If you only find a match for the 6 main ones, you will still achieve a result very close to what I have here. Feel free to use your favorite brands. It's really up to you, and you will find some alternative suggestions in the handout. The most important learning that I want you to take away from this is that you can have a rather limited palette, and by arranging your pigments in a different way and layering them using different transparency and different saturation, you can achieve a completely different result every time. So the first one we will need is purple, and I use dioxazine purple from Core. Core watercolors are super vibrant, but may be difficult to control. They use a different type of binder from typical watercolors like Winsor & Newton or Daniel Smith. So the flow in the water is a bit more unpredictable. It takes time getting used to, but the result is extra vibrant. And you may want to choose something more conservative like Imperial Purple from Daniel Smith or any other purple from your favorite brand. Next, we have violet, and there's so many options available. I went with quinacridone violet from Core. Just make sure that it's more on the red side than the blue, otherwise it will get lost when you add it on top of your purples. And if you want it to stand out more, you can go with something more pink, like magenta, quinacridone magenta, or even something like Bordeaux from Daniel Smith. We will definitely need a red for our pansies, a cool red. I would say stay away from warmer reds, more orangey reds, because they will clash with the rest of the palette. So something like carmine, which is what I used, carmine from Daniel Smith, or you can also go with quinacridone red or permanent alizarin crimson. Both would work very well. We will need a warm brown, and I decided to go with Perylin Maroon, which is sort of a brick red, brownish color. We will primarily use this pigment for warm shadows, in other words, shadows that contain some bounce back light reflections from other petals, and also for some very fine details on those white elements in the middle of each flower. On the red pansies, we will also need this warm brown in order to create outlines for our petals. You can really go with whatever your favorite warm brown is. Something like brown madder will give you a more subtle look. If you choose, let's say, quinacridone burnt orange, more orangey brown, it will stand out much more. I encourage you to experiment with different browns and see which one you like best. We will need a warm medium yellow to paint the center of each flower, and also, of course, the base for our yellow pansies. I'm using one from Core. You can use something like Winsor Yellow from Winsor Newton, really any of your favorite warm yellows. Perhaps stay away from lemon yellow or Indian yellow or any of the cooler yellows, as they would clash with the rest of the palettes. For orange, which is really optional for this type of painting, although it's quite easy to find in any palette, so I would say go with it if you have it. I decided to go with Hansa Yellow Deep. It's really an orangey yellow, not quite a full orange. You can go with something much darker and redder if you want, but there are also lots of mid-range choices like yellow orange from Schminke. Lastly, our green, we only need a little bit of it in the center of each flower, and also for some shadows on our yellow pansy. Pick your favorite warm green. I went with sap green, pretty straightforward choice. I would definitely stay away from more vibrant bluish greens. Blue we will only need once on our purple pansies, and I use Phthalo Blue green shade. I tend to favor non-granulating colors, but really any cold blue will work here. So don't worry about the exact shade, just pick your favorite non-granulating blue. Now let's talk about building our palette structure for each flower using these 8 pigments. If you've taken any of my previous classes or have seen any of my YouTube videos, you may have seen this diagram, which is essentially a map I created to help you organize your watercolor pigments for any botanical subject according to the direction of light. We always have our base pigment, which is this big circle in the middle, and this is the most important choice you will make. It's the pigment that will keep the entire palette together. Everything else will be in relation to this pigment in terms of the temperature and saturation of your colors. In some cases, you may want to add a boost pigment to brighten up your base. It's usually close on the spectrum, can be cooler or more likely warmer and much more vibrant than your base. In case of our pansies, we actually don't need a boost because the base colors we will be using are all quite strong. So then you have your highlights and your shadows, and of course these pigments will appear on your subject depending on how light hits it. So highlights are typically warmer and lighter than your base. So on our purple pansy, for example, we'll use a light wash of our cool red as our highlight. Shadows are much more complicated and often include more than one pigment. So shadows can contain reflections from other subjects, and I recommend using both cold and warm shadow pigments in order to differentiate these different reflections. For example, in the case of our red Pency, we will use brown for our warmer shadows because it contains some yellow highlights, reflections from other petals, and we will use violet for our cooler shadows. Finally, there are always additional color spots. So in case of Pensies, we have these large dark spots on each flower and also some deeply saturated lines that I call veins. So we will need to set aside some pigments for that. We'll explore this in more detail as we paint each flower. So with this in mind, let's explore each flower and how the palette structure that we just discussed might look. First, let's talk about the base pigments. These are the most important ones, and it's pretty straightforward. We will need purple for our purple Pensies, and I'm using Dioxazine purple. Pick your favorite purple for the base here. A cool red for our red Pensies. I'm using Carmine from Daniel Smith. And a warm mid-range yellow for our yellow Pensies. Now let's talk about supporting colors for each of our base colors, for each of our different colored Pency. We will use our cool red for highlights on the purple Pency, violet for some warm shadows and also some fancy details on the edges of the petals, blue, and blue only appears on this purple Pency, by the way, on a few bright spots and also on some of the petals in the background. As I mentioned, blue helps you set things back visually, so just to help us bring those petals to the background. Finally, warm brown for some very light details in the middle of the flower. Finally, you will note that I have these yellow, green, orange boxes on the right. This is reserved specifically for the center of the flower, that little area in the middle where we don't have our base color, and it has its own logic. So yellow is our base for that area, green is for shadows in that area, and orange, an optional color if you want to use it, will be our boost color there. So that trio will be the same for each flower, yellow, orange, green, not just for the purple Pensies. On each flower in the center, we will use the same structure. For our red Pensies, we will need even less pigments. So purple, of course, for cool shadows, and also those big dark spots in the middle. A bit of violet for warm shadows, brown for warm shadows and details in the middle of the flower, and again that trio, yellow, orange, green, that we just talked about in the middle. For our yellow Pency, we will need a bit of orange to boost the base yellow pigment, and I'm using sort of a yellowish orange, very light orange, hence a yellow deep from Daniel Smith. Purple and violet in order to paint those dark spots in the middle, and a warm brown, which I ended up mixing with some green and orange to come up with different shadow variations throughout the petals. Of course, pure yellow and green in the middle. That center of the Pensies really doesn't change much, so we'll keep it consistent. Okay, so again, you can find the reference diagrams for each flower in the class handout. And I hope you're finding this informative and fun, not just in the context of these Pensies, but hopefully in general, it can help you think through different palette structures. In the next lesson, we'll talk about how to draw a Pency outline without a reference photo. You can skip this step and go straight to painting if you want to. Of course, you can download black and white outlines, my reference outlines on Skillshare website in the class resources section. Hello. In this lesson, we're going to talk about a really simple way that you can use in order to come up with an accurate outline for a Pency flower. Now, you don't have to sketch it by hand. You can simply download a black and white outline from class resources on the Skillshare website. But if you are interested in learning how to build your flower shape from scratch, even without a reference photo or an outline, then take a look at this. So essentially, before we get started, all you need is a pencil, and you will need something to help you come up with a round shape. So you can either use a compass tool, or you can use something like a household object that's a perfect circle, like what I used here, which is just like a lid from a jar. Now keep in mind that in order for this video to be crisp and sharp, I used a very soft blue pencil and red and purple markers, but that's just so you can see the outlines easily. For your final work on watercolor paper, I highly recommend using a very hard pencil, something like 3H or 4H, so that your outline is very faint and you don't leave any graffiti marks on paper.
First, you need to draw a circle, just like that. And once you have a nice circle, find the center of the circle. If you're using a compass tool, it would be much easier to find, but you can just approximately outline the center. Just put a dot so you know this will be the center of your flower. And the next thing that will help you find the right placement for the petals will be 2 lines, vertical and horizontal, just like that, going across and through the center of the circle. So now that you've divided the circle in 4 parts, you can start from the center and draw the front petal just like a sort of an upside down heart. You can see that it will be the biggest petal, and then from there you can do 2 symmetrical petals going to the left and to the right. Let me outline the front petal a little bit more so you can see it better. You can see it's sort of like an oval or an upside down heart, and then the 2 background petals will be right there in the back. So that's a typical pansy shape, 5 petals. And now I'm just going to use a red marker to outline my shape so you can see exactly how it fits into the circle. So you can see the largest front petal. Nothing is really going outside that circle outline. Everything just sort of fits. But we created an easy pansy shape without any reference. Now, when you're about to start painting, these are the parts that we will need to cover with masking fluid. These little beards coming from the inside, and they're sort of attached to the front petal, and a little bit of highlights because the petals are quite thick. So if your source of light is on the left, then these are the parts that I would either keep white or put some masking fluid on them. And now the spots, really easy again, just going around the center of the circle. I'm gonna try again, but without drawing my circle. So I'm just kind of imagining a circle outline, and because I've done this so many times, I'm just going to use the dot and the cross method. So here's my little center of the flower, and then I have sort of the skeleton, the vertical and the horizontal line, and then I'm going to start with the front petal again, just an upside down heart shape, very symmetrical, left petal and right petal, again just going from the center, everything is coming out from the center, and then the petal on the back and another one. The 2 in the back are overlapping. Here I'm gonna go with a red marker just so you can see better. You have a nice big front petal. You can make the edges a bit more wavy just to add a little bit more interest. Depending on what flower you're painting, they might be more straight or more wavy. And here's our pansy. Again, I did this just by imagining a circle around my dot, but you can draw the circle if it's easier for you. Now this is the part that we're going to keep white in the beginning, outline it with a masking fluid. I'm just covering it with a purple marker to show you so you can see better. This is our source of light coming from the left down, and you have a couple of edges of the petals that you may want to outline with a masking fluid as well, just to keep them white, to preserve those highlights. And now the color spots, they will follow the natural direction of the petal, and you can use those faint outlines, the pencil outlines of the horizontal and vertical lines to help you make them symmetrical. Here we go, 2 on each side. And this is your typical Pency flower. This is how you can make one without a reference photo, or if you have a reference photo, this method will just help you keep your flower more symmetrical and more accurate. So we're ready to paint, and in the first lesson I will show you how to paint this purple Pency flower. We're going to do it step by step in real time, and if you saw me describe the process in one of the previous lessons, this only includes 5 steps. So we're going to start with step 1, which is our outline and masking fluid. And in terms of the outline, what you will see me do on the right hand side is just draw it by hand. I'm using a hard pencil. I'm using 4H just so that I don't leave any marks on my paper. But if you are not comfortable drawing it by hand using a reference photo, by all means feel free to use the black and white outline that I created and saved in the resources section of this class on the Skillshare website. You can also trace. There's absolutely no right way of creating outlines. I think what we want to do is to focus on practicing watercolor techniques, and so use whichever method you prefer. When your outline is done, what we need to do is mask some of the white areas with masking fluid. So we're going to end up with something like this. You can see sort of the masking fluid shining in the light. And if you don't have masking fluid, as I mentioned before, don't worry, you can just paint around those areas, or you can use white gouache or white watercolor to cover them afterwards. So don't let the fact that you may not have masking fluid discourage you. If you do have masking fluid, grab your most comfortable applicator and just follow along. So you can use like an old brush, just make sure to clean it after, or you can use a matchstick. We're gonna mask just a tiny little spot here and there, so those 2 little parts in the middle that are at the base of the side petals. And the other thing I'm going to mask is just some of the edges of the petals. And what you will notice is I'm only doing it on the left side of the petals. So essentially where the light hits the petal, I want to make sure that I capture that and create a nice edge that we will erase later. And now let's start with our first layer of color. This is our background layer, and our objective here is to create a really light wash of color just to establish the color scheme. This is the most important part of the painting, and if we get this right, the next steps should be much easier for us. So the technique is called wet on wet, and essentially what I'm doing is applying a thin layer of my base pigment, in this case purple, and I'm going to add some other colors into it wet on wet. So we have to work fast before the paper dries out, and you will notice that I'm painting 1 petal at a time, and this is just to make sure that my paper doesn't get dry. In terms of the pigments that we will use at this stage, I'm going to use purple, violet to kind of create some nice juicy highlights, and if you don't have quinacridone violet, which is what I'm using, magenta will actually look a lot brighter. I've tried that before and it works really well. We'll also need a bit of cool red or pink, and I'm going to use carmine. Opera pink would look amazing, but as some of you may already know, it's a fugitive color, so it will fade. So this is why I'm going to use carmine. And a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of green, just a bit. So in terms of some key principles that will help you along the way, as I mentioned, wet on wet technique requires painting without any breaks, so make sure that you choose smaller areas, like one petal at a time, and work until the paper is dry. The second thing I wanted to mention is this layer has to be very light, so you can see my purple is really diluted, and this is because with watercolors we're always painting light to dark. We're building our layers from light to dark because you can't go back and erase anything. So make sure to keep it very light, and you may even want to pre-mix your light purple before you're starting so that you don't get a lot of variation, and just continue working confidently. And finally, when you're applying your boost colors, cool red or pink or violet, make sure the direction of your brush is following the direction of the petal, so essentially from the edge of the petal sort of towards the center, and that will help us create a more realistic look. So now looking at the reference photo, let's just follow along, and what you will see me do is I just finished the first petal on the left, and I'm just moving the color around. I have my base purple and a little bit of violet on the edges, and I'm just helping it kind of spread down towards the center. Now I'm going to drop a little bit of carmine just on the top because I feel like there's some sunshine there seeping through, and maybe a bit of more saturated purple just to create some shadow areas. And now let's do the next petal. I'm gonna pick this top petal. It's a bit lighter as I'm looking at my reference photo, so I'm gonna start with a really light pink spot, again using my carmine, and then I'm gonna continue with my purple, just going around it. Very, very light. We can always make it darker. For now, I just want to cover everything with a light purple wash. By the way, wet on wet can be done just on clear water, just using a clear water base, so you don't have to start with purple, but I'm fairly confident that using a light purple wash will work here just as fine. So you can see I sort of created that big petal shape, and now I'm gonna start dropping more colors. A bit more pink, or specifically carmine is what I'm using. And now let's do a little bit of violet on the edge, much more saturated, but still quite light. And I'm just dragging my brush along the edge, watching the pigment spread, adding a little bit more purple. And I'm gonna leave it to dry and move on to our bottom petal. The same principle, I'm just going to cover everything with a light purple wash, perhaps a bit darker towards the center of the flower, but overall very, very light. Spread that pigment around. If there's some variation of light and dark, you don't need to worry about it because there's going to be lots more detail. that we're gonna have to take care of. So just look at it overall. Is this sort of the lightest wash you can do? Maybe it's a bit darker towards the middle. I think that's good. I'm gonna drop a little bit of blue, and I'm using phthalo blue green shade, one of my favorite pigments. It's gonna pop right there in the middle. And now same thing we've done before, just going over the edge with the tip of my brush and applying quinacridone violet. And hopefully your paper is still completely wet there. And so what you want to achieve here is a really sharp edge, but the color is spreading towards the middle and into the purple. Now let's do the right petal. Same thing again. I'm gonna create a light purple wash and follow with a little bit of violet and a little bit of carmine. Maybe a little bit more saturated purple right there on the right, the bottom, since that part of the petal is in the shadow. And now I'm going with the tip of my brush, just creating those nice saturated edges with my violet. Let's do the last petal. It's really light. It's facing the sun. It's right there in the back, and it's sort of turned towards the sun. So you can see I started with a very light spot of carmine, or whatever pink you're using will work. And then I'm just going around it, sort of blending it with my light purple. And towards the center, it's going to get darker. You can see me applying a bit more purple there. And then I'm starting to define those petal grooves, just a little bit wet on wet, with some purple and some carmine. Just a few strokes, following the direction of the petal. And you can see in the reference photo, it's a lot more pink, that petal, because it's getting more sun. But towards the center, it gets darker. So here I go again with a bit more saturated purple this time. Blend it around, and I'm just going to leave it. I think this is what we wanted to achieve. I'm going to make sure that my front petal is dry and paint the center of the flower with a light wash of yellow, and then add a little bit of much deeper yellow right there where the yellow blends with purple. A little bit of green on top. And that would be our background layer for the center of the flower. Allow your layers to dry for at least 2-3 hours. I gave it a day just to make sure that your paper is completely dry, because our next step is going to involve wet on dry technique. In other words, we're going to be layering wet transparent color over dry paint. So our objective here is to define larger areas of light and shadow, boost some colors in some places, and to really add detailed texture on our petals. So we're going to be painting a lot of those petal grooves. And the pigments I'm using are mostly the same as the ones we've used on the background layer. So just purple, violet, red, or pink, and blue. And I switched to a smaller brush. You can see me going over this first petal with my Skoda Versatile, but this time it's in size 2, so I need a much finer tip. And what you will see me do essentially is move from the edge of each petal towards the center, and there will be areas that I'm going to leave completely blank. For the most part, I am going to just create these grooves, and they will be mostly purple with some other colors dropped into them wet on wet. So your pigment saturation should be 2 steps darker than your base layer, but still quite transparent. So you still want to see sort of your color wash underneath, but it should be a bit darker. And again, we're directing our strokes from the edge of the petal down. Don't worry so much about your reference photo. I would say that the key thing would be to actually look at the shape of the petal that you've already created and just sort of recognize those wavy edges, and each wavy edge would inform where you have an area of light and an area of shadow. So as you can see me do here. So at this point, I'm loosely referring to my reference photo, but I'm just trying to create some variation and some texture on the petal, and I'm just creating those shadowy grooves, mostly with my purple. Sometimes if I'm painting on a very light pinkish area, I'm gonna add a little bit of carmine. I'm very aware of the reference photo, but I'm also considering the source of light, and I know that generally speaking, judging by the shape of my petals, in order to make this look realistic, the bottom half of the side petals will always be darker because it doesn't get as much light, and the base of the top petal will also be darker. So I'll make sure that I create those shadows in this step. And finally, on the bottom front petal, I'm just going to drag a few lines from the edge towards the center, and there are a couple of very defined grooves there already, judging by the edge of my petal. So I'm just going to use that as a guide and create those lines with my light purple. And now to define the center of the flower, I'm just going to add a little bit of sap green right there in the middle, blend it with my brush. This is really deep inside the flower, so there's a lot of shadows there. And that little bit on top, if you look closely at the reference photo, it's a bit brownish, so I'm going to use my warm brown here, reddish brown, create an outline and let it dry so we can move on to our next layer. And this is sort of the exciting part where we get to create those spots, those dark spots on the petals, and some really defined veins. The technique we're going to be using is wet on dry again, and a little bit of what I call a combo technique, which is sort of a blend of wet on dry and wet on wet. I'm going to show you that in detail in a minute. If it's easier for you, you may want to outline the spots before you paint with a pencil. I'm sort of eyeballing it and starting with my base purple, but a lot more saturated, as you can see. And so again, because we're going to be doing a lot of wet on wet, we want to make sure that the area we're working on is always wet. So let's paint maybe 1, maximum 2 petals at a time. And when we're doing our veins, they're going to be even more saturated than the spot. So you can see what I did here is create a spot with purple, and then I dropped a little bit of my carmine in there. You could go with opera pink or quinacridone rose just to make it even more vibrant. It will really look nice blend it with your purple there. And so what I'm doing here now is I'm actually dragging the tip of my brush across the petals, starting on the dry area and towards the center. So I'm starting wet on dry and then dragging it into the wet area, and it's becoming wet on wet. So what's happening here is the beginning of the vein will be super precise, and then where it hits the wet spot, it will be spreading a little bit and blending with the background color. Now the trick here is to make sure that your wet spot is not too wet. You don't want too much water sitting on top of your paper. You kind of want to allow your water to sink in, maybe a minute or two, and I can show you here what that looks like sort of at an angle. You can see how the light hits it. It's wet, but it's not completely overflowing with water. It's almost half a minute before it starts drying out. So let's try this again on the next side petal. So I'm going to create this kind of a jagged blob of color with purple, add a little bit of carmine, violet, maybe more purple. And now let's drag those lines, and you can actually do that from the center out or the other way around, doesn't matter. Again, the trick is to make sure that your paper is not too wet, but not dry yet. So here I'm actually going to try to follow the reference photo much more closely, because it's easy to get carried away with these lines and it's starting to look like a spider. So, you know, a couple of thicker lines, I see 5 on that petal, and then a few smaller sort of more finer lines branching out. One thing you can do is, instead of just doing them in purple, combine 2 colors, so your purple and your violet or your purple and magenta. That would add a bit of visual interest to your painting. It depends on how comfortable you are and how fine your brush is. Let's do the front petal. So by now you're familiar with the process. I'm gonna paint my dark purple spot. Not too dark just yet, because I want the lines to be visible, and then I'm gonna add a bit of violet and carmine just to warm it up. More purple on the left because that side is away from the sun. The right side is more likely to catch sun rays, and drag a few preliminary lines. Maybe add a little bit more saturation there. Wait about a minute and go with my thin brush from the center out. Very carefully, one line at a time. I'm just testing to see. It feels like maybe I started a bit too early. It's really not a scientific process. It's very different every time, so forgive me, I'm not giving you a precise timeline on how long you need to wait before your water is ready or your surface is ready. So you sort of test it and see, is it spreading out too much? Do you still see the line after you put down your stroke? If you do, if you still see that line and it's not blending into the background, that's the right sort of result that we want. You can see on the right side there, I started a bit too earlier, so it's kind of spreading a bit more out of control, but that will happen, and it can always be fixed. We can always go over it again with more saturated line, or we can lift the color. It's all good. So I think I'm happy for now with this petal. These top 2 are a bit different because they don't really have that dark spot, so I'm just gonna cover that area at the base of the petal with clear water, and then do a couple of dark purple lines just as they appear in the reference photo. clear water to get that nice spread where our line is not too precise. It's sort of looking more natural, and there we go. Again, let's let this dry and make sure it's all completely dry before we erase the masking fluid. It's super important to make sure that your paper is completely dry before you erase the masking fluid. So again, I gave it about 6 hours this time. And with my retractable eraser, I'm just gonna remove the masking fluid in those areas where I put it, and then we're going to fix them up in the final stage, which is our finishing touches phase. And this is really an opportunity for us to take a look at the overall painting now that the pigments are all dry. And as most of you know, watercolors, when they dry out, they look less vibrant. It's almost ready, and this is sort of what it's going to look like going forward. And we can now finish this up by fixing a few minor details, like especially you will find when you remove masking fluid, there will be some edges that need attention. And we may want to adjust our colors in some spots, maybe boost some of them. And I'm going to start with the center of the flower just to warm it up, make that spot pop. It's a beautiful contrast with purple, so I want to make it more pronounced, more intense. And the second thing I'm going to do is now go wet on dry with the very tip of my brush and maybe add a few more veins, but like much thinner than I did before. You can see in the reference photo, especially at the bottom of the flower, there's a lot more sort of little lines and veins that are almost magenta colored. So I'm gonna do that just to stay true to the subject and add a bit of visual interest. But as I mentioned before, it's quite easy to overdo it, so you don't want it to look sort of too spotted or like a zebra with just lines going up and down. So just be not too generous with your lines. Maybe just let's stick to the bottom. Another thing I'm gonna do is accentuate those shadows on the top of the side petals and maybe add a little bit more detail there on the edge. Again, looking very closely at the reference photo. Now what we're doing is just making it more realistic, more unique, painting those little imperfections and adding a little bit more definition to our shadows. So I think I'm happy with this side. I'm gonna switch to the side petal on the left and do something similar, add a little bit more carmine right there on top. Again, this is just because I know the sun is almost shining through that petal, so it's getting a lot more warm color. And then on the edges, I see some spots there that I want to include. And now these two folds on top of the front petal, I want to make sure that I don't leave them white. So cover them with a very light wash of violet. And now let's move on to the top. I'm just going to go over it with tiny little strokes. Again, always following the direction of the petal from the edge down, just to add a little bit more interest there, and then maybe boost the shadow. That area is really not directly in the sunlight, so I'm gonna make it a bit darker. And maybe one more blue spot. We have one on the front petal, but here I see an opportunity to add another one, and it's nice because it's gonna tie it all together, top and bottom, using phthalo blue, and just on the edge blending it down. Here's another one. Maybe this part is not so true to the reference photo, but I feel like it still looks natural enough, and so that our one blue spot from before doesn't look completely out of place. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the process. We will follow a variation of this process on the next two flowers with some adjustments for color, of course, and some of the steps. But overall, I hope you enjoyed the layering and using different watercolor techniques from start to finish to build a realistic flower shape. I'll see you in the next lesson.